So we have the spending review, we have the cut. Some people say the Chancellor has taken an axe to welfare. Others say it's not so much an axe as a tiny, weeny pair of tweezers, which is going to make not a jot or a ha'porth of difference. I wonder where Jonathan Davis, the economist, stands on this. And let's ask him. Jonathan, thanks for joining us. Good morning.
Good morning, Vanessa.
Well, what's your response to this latest package of cuts and spending?
I think it's political evasion of economic reality. All politicians do it. One of your earlier callers was railing into Thatcher as if she created the end of the Western world. He obviously forgot about what happened in the 13 years between the Tories and the coalition, where we had the biggest rise in debt in human history. Here's an interesting economic statistic. It took 400 years of recorded economic history until 1997, when Labour came in, for household debt to get to £500 billion. 7 years later, it had doubled. Now, getting back to your question, £11 billion of supposed cuts, what it actually means is a reduction in increases. So, you know, what they're spending now and what they'll be spending in the next Parliament is still going to be a great deal more than the previous government were spending. This is the main point, and you've touched on it slightly in the last 10 or 20 minutes.
Yes.
One, we as a country, the government is borrowing over £100 billion a year. Every year we're adding to the amount we owe, which is £1,200 billion, and that doesn't include things like the Private Finance Initiative, civil service pensions, and so on. We are bankrupt. Do you know, your listeners, I think, will be astonished by this statistic. This year, our government will spend just on debt interest, not hospitals, not education, just interest, £51 billion.
All right, now imagine, Jonathan, and it will be a slight leap of imagination. Imagine you were talking not to Vanessa Feltz on BBC London 94.9, but to Chancellor Osborne himself. You were talking to him and you were saying this to him. Now, he wouldn't just sit there nodding and accepting what you were saying. What would he say to counter what you're saying?
He say, I've got an election to win in 2015. I'm making a serious point. That's all he and politicians care about. They don't care about you and me. All they care about is winning elections. And there is no doubt that actually it is mildly politically acceptable now, indeed preferred, to be talking about cuts rather than talking about profligacy. The public want the cuts. Not everyone, obviously, but the more than 50% want the cuts. That's why they're doing it. But it's not going to help the economy, and our kids are going to be paying for this through the nose.
All right, Jonathan, what choice does Chancellor Osborne have? What else could he do? When you talk about, you know, the interest on the interest, when you talk about what's being accrued moment by moment by moment, and it's, you know, the sums are so vast, you with your financial brain can probably encompass them. I can't really imagine them. They're so enormous, they're kind of unimaginably huge. What could he do? What should he do?
First of all, let me simplify the issue. I say we're borrowing £100 billion a year. For the average family, that's equivalent to borrowing £11,000 a year.
Right.
That's for a family earning about £67,000 a year. That's with a family that owes £120,000 on the plastic, not even counting the mortgage. That's how bankrupt we are. Now, your specific question, what can he do? What I find astounding is that the major political parties, the Liberal Democrats, the Labours, the Conservatives, actually, they're in broad agreement as to what should happen. They're all in agreement about bailing out the banks. They're all in agreement about high borrowings, high spending, zero interest rates. In effect, they're all in agreement. There's a tiny wafer-thin crack between them. Although if you watch Question Time on BBC One, they'll pretend there's a Grand Canyon between them. There isn't. So what we need is a radical change in our economic policies. What we need is for interest rates to be normalised. They have been far too low for far too long.
Well, I'm just going to interrupt you and say front page story yesterday was Lord King, Mervyn King, saying that the baby boomer generation has done fine in the property market, but the rest of the property owners, I mean, in other words, the younger ones, are poised on the brink of a hideous abyss, because if interest rates go up, they'll be hurtling into the inferno. They won't be able to keep their property. So is that what you want to happen? Because that's what will happen, isn't it?
Inevitably, if interest rates were to rise, and they must rise, although they probably won't, if they were to rise, there's no doubt we would have a couple of years of great economic difficulty. But you know what? With our currency much stronger, it would make our import costs much cheaper, which means that the living standards of every man, woman and child in this country would rise, and the costs of running businesses would fall, which means employment would rise. We would have economic growth for a generation. Instead, they continue to pronounce we must have a lower currency, and what does that do? It keeps us in the 30-year depression that they brought us into.
Jonathan, as individuals, is there anything that we can do or should do? Is one of the things we should do if we happen to have a few quid, not trust the banks, because we need to worry that we might end up in a sort of Cypriot situation where we can't get whatever money we've managed to save over a lifetime out?
We know that the Bank of England and other central banks have already drawn up rules for taking money away from depositors. We know it. It's a fact. I think we have to take the precedent of Cyprus that it's unlikely that if an individual has more than £85,000, has less than £85,000 in a banking institution, that money would be taken, and £170,000 for a couple. So up to £170,000 in one banking institution per couple should be okay. Above that, you'd be mad if you don't spread it between banking institutions. The other thing is, as the government and the central bank, the Bank of England, keep on producing funny money, they keep printing this money, they call it quantitative easing, eventually, I tell you, our currency will be debased. This may take years, but our currency will be debased. In the long term, if you haven't got holdings in real assets like gold or oil shares, oil company shares, for example, for the long term, in the short term they can go down, but in the long term, if you haven't got wealth in those areas, then you could well be toast.
Wow. Jonathan Davis, always an explosive guest. Thank you very much for talking to us, Jonathan Davis, economist and wealth manager. Let's go to